All right, you all. I know folks will continue to join until well into the presentation. So thank you so much for joining us today. I know that we've had some pre-recorded ones in the past few weeks, and so we've been off our live schedule here lately. But I'm super excited to give it over to Dr. Sheldon Owen, who's with the West Virginia University Extension Service. He knows the ins and outs of so many different wildlife species in our state. It's really amazing to talk to him. So hopefully you'll have that opportunity here in this coming year. But today he's talking about bats of West Virginia. And so we're thrilled to have him. And I just wanted to reassure you one more time that we will send the recording out after this. We've already started recording. And you will receive that before Monday of next week. All right, Sheldon, if you're ready.
I think I'm ready. Happy Friday, everyone. Very close to the weekend now. I hope you are all doing well and staying safe and healthy out there. So I am Sheldon Owen. I'm the Extension Wildlife Specialist with the West Virginia University Extension Service. I'm housed here in Morgantown, West Virginia on campus, on WVU campus. But prior to we would travel all over the state talking about various wildlife issues, wildlife habitat management, wildlife damage management, and just general natural history of our wildlife species to groups just like this all over the state. Kevin, give me a thumbs up to make sure the sound's coming through okay, to make sure. I'm having a glitch with my camera today, but just want to make sure the sound is coming through.
Sound is great.
We're good there, Kevin?
We're good.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm always worried about this technology. I could speak for another 30 minutes and no one hear a thing, and they're just waiting on something to start. So excited to be here today because bats are one of my favorite groups. There's groups of wildlife species out there because they're so interesting. So just want to give you some general information about our bats of West Virginia. And we'll talk about some that are beyond our borders in West Virginia as well, just to give you a good understanding of our bat species today. So we're talking about bats, and this is the Virginia big-eared bat. It's one of our federally endangered species. It can be found here in West Virginia. You can see these are my fingers holding it with these latex gloves. When we're handling bats or working with bats, this COVID has really given us a prime example of how we need to make sure we're taking the proper precautions when we're working with not only wildlife species, but even our domestic animals. If we're handling them, if they get sick, every now and then they can actually transmit diseases to us. And so we want to make sure that we're protecting ourselves, and we're also protecting our bats. So if I start handling multiple species with the same pair of gloves, I could potentially transmit diseases between bats. And so, we're taking the proper precautions to not only protect ourselves, to protect our wildlife species as well. But we'll start talking in general about the classification of our bat species. So bats are found in the order Chiroptera. Chiroptera actually means hand wing. So if you look at this photo here in the lower right-hand corner, you can kind of make out why it gets that name. Because if you look at their arms, there's the humerus and the radius and the ulna, and here's the hand. So here's the thumb, digits 1, 2, 3, and 4, which actually give structure to that wing. And so hand wing is basically the Greek etymology of Chiroptera. So around the world, they're nearly global in distribution. They're not found in Antarctica or up around the Arctic Circle just because of the extreme cold temperatures. They are mammals, so they're warm-blooded. If you can remember back what makes a mammal or what sets a mammal apart from all the other classification, other classes of species, mammals have hair, they're warm-blooded, they give live birth, they feed their young milk. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings or kind of, I guess myths and legends about our bats, because when we think about bats, we're thinking about Halloween, we're thinking about vampires, and we're thinking these old wives' tales about how bats will fly into your hair and lay eggs and drive you crazy, right? This is what we hear about our bats. They are mammals. They give live birth, so they don't lay eggs, and they're trying to avoid you in most cases just as much as you're trying to avoid them. But nearly global in distribution around the world, we have a little over 1,400 species of bats. So basically about 20% of our mammalian species are bats. So they're a large group, second only to our rodents, the order of Rodentia. There's about 40% of our mammals are made up of the rodent order, but second to them, 20% of our mammals around the world are bats. They're very specialized because, one, they're the only group, they're the only mammal capable of true powered flight. You may have heard of the flying squirrel, which can glide down from an elevated position, but they can't take off and fly back up from the ground up to the tree from which they just left. Our bats are the only ones who have that ability of true powered flight. And they're very specialized in, how they look, their morphology, and also their behavior and their physiology as well. So if you look at our bats, the smallest bat, here's the smallest bat in the world up in the upper right-hand corner, our bumblebee bat found over in Thailand, which weighs about 2 grams. Compare that to a penny, which weighs about 3 grams. So it weighs less than a penny. And the entire bat, this is an adult, full size, fits in the palm of the hand or over just a couple of the fingers. So very small bat. Compare that to the largest bat in the world, which is our giant flying fox. It has about a 6-foot wingspan. And so I'm 6 feet tall, and it basically can, if you spread out its wings, you go 6 inches from the tip of the wing to the tip of the opposite wing. Weighs about 3.5 pounds or 1,600 grams. So that, a major size difference, about a 10 times magnitude difference in size from a penny, the bumblebee bat, 2 grams, to that 1,600 gram giant flying fox. But fascinating species, and we'll talk about some of that diversity within this group. They all look the same, right? They have these hand wings, which will give you an example of the structure here to help you visualize that skeletal structure. So here's, the humerus and the radius. The ulna and the radius is actually reduced because they want to keep it a rigid wing, right? We need that for structure for flight. But here's that hand. Here's the thumb, the first, second, third, and fourth finger, which give structure to that wing. And so now we've got this kind of leathery membrane that covers the wings. You can still see the fingers through the wing there. So that's where we get the chiroptera. Some people will pronounce it chiroptera. I'm just going to stick with chiroptera just because I like to say it that way. But hand wing, but very fascinating group of species here. Now, if you look, they have those large wings. They may be different in size, but across the gamut, these 1,400 plus species, they all look quite different, and some can be very unique. We have some that have very large ears to record or listen to those echolocation calls that are coming back. Some have extremely large eyes. They may not use echolocation and may just use sight as they're flying around, some of our flying foxes. Very interesting structures and protuberances and folds of skin on their face to help kind of funnel these echolocation calls. And look at this one with a little spear or leaf-like structure on its nose. And then this one up here is obviously the coolest of the bunch with this kind of mohawk tuft of hair on his head. Across the board, these are some fascinating looking and very interesting looking species with different colors and shapes and forms and structures on their body. So, across the board, these just are unique individuals to look at, but also their behaviors are quite unique as well. So if we just look at diet, we have some bats that feed primarily on fish, some that eat frogs and even other bats. We have some carnivores out there that will eat rodents and mice off the forest floor. We do have 3 species of vampire bats. They don't occur here in West Virginia, but 3 species of vampire bats that drink blood, and that's what they feed on primarily. This is the common vampire bat found down in Central and South America. And then we kind of have the more common diets now that we're used to. We have those that eat fruit, the frugivores, the nectivores they're feeding on nectar and pollen in some of our flowering plants. And then I guess the most broadest group, in the group that we have here in West Virginia, all feed on insects, those insectivores. So around 1,400 species around the world. Across the United States, we have about 47 species that occur in the United States and 14 species found here in West Virginia. And all 14 species that have been recorded here in West Virginia eat insects, and they eat a lot of insects. So our bats can eat about 75% to 100% of their body weight each night. So if you can see the video of me, I'm about 6 feet tall, I weigh right at 200 pounds. And so if I were to eat 75% of my body weight or even 100% of my body weight, I'd be eating around 600 to 1,800 quarter pounders, right? Quarter pound hamburgers every night or every day to keep up enough energy to survive. So that's amazing, a large amount of insects that are taking off the landscape each year. Now, our average size of bat here in West Virginia is about 6 to 8 inches in wingspan or width, and they weigh about 6 to 8 grams. So let's assume they're eating 8 grams, 100% of their body weight, or 8 grams of insects each night. 8 grams doesn't sound like much, right? It's 8 grams, that's maybe 2 pennies in weight worth of insects off the landscape. But multiply that times 100 bats, or 1,000 bats, or 100,000 bats. We don't know exactly how many bats we have on the landscape, but they're all out there during the summer months eating insects. And we're talking about metric tons of insects that are eaten each night while these bats are out there foraging. So they're one of our primary predators of nocturnal insects. Many of these insects are some of our agricultural pests. And so they do a great ecological service of removing those agricultural pests from the landscape and saving all of our farmers and agricultural producers from having to use pesticides, because they're out there eating these insects that are damaging our crops. They're also eating mosquitoes. I don't know how many of you love mosquitoes out there on the landscape, but they're also eating mosquitoes and sort of that great natural predator of these nocturnal insects. So a great ecological service provided by just them out eating insects every night. Now they roost, they're nocturnal. So here in West Virginia, they're active at night and they sleep during the day. And they sleep during the day in a variety of different locations. We have some bats that will use cavities or exfoliating bark if they can find a little fissure or some little shelf of bark that they can crawl up underneath. We can find them roosting under bridges, in old barns, and structures. Some of you may have had bats get into your house because they're roosting in the attic. So they're sleeping during the day and out foraging at night, but they use a variety of different structures. Our big-eared bats, that picture I showed you at the very first, they're going to use caves pretty much year-round. So some of them will use caves only during the winter and then come out and use trees or human domestic structures during the summer months. Like the Virginia big-eared bats, they're just going to stay in the cage year-round because it's a great place for them to spend their days resting and then coming out at night to feed. Now, bats are not blind. They can actually see quite well, but they do have this acoustical orientation mechanism where they can emit sound waves from the larynx, like me talking to you. So they're emitting these clicks or sound waves. And as those waves go out, they hit an object like a fly, a mosquito or moth. And then those echoes, as those sound waves bounce back, with these ears, they can determine the direction of travel, the speed of travel, the size of the object, all of this information from these sound waves of these echolocation calls that they are producing. They can see quite well, so if they come down and get a drink of water and have their mouth full of water, they can still see to fly around. But this is such a more advanced or higher advanced form of orientation and navigation that hey, if we need to fly in the black of night, we can still find our way around out there and find insects to feed upon. So echolocation calls are very interesting. We're still learning a lot about that, but we can identify our bat species by their echolocation calls. The different frequencies which they call, some of the harmonics of the call, we can identify our bat species from those calls. Now they're above 20 kilohertz, and so in most cases we can't actually hear bats calling because it's out of our range of hearing. So we have these devices, and I can show you some devices later, that actually record those calls and divide it down and display the acoustics or display the harmonics of the call, so we can actually look at the sound waves themselves to identify these species. You may, if you're out in some open areas around town and in open fields and pastures, you may actually, as bats are flying around, you may actually hear this clicking sound as they're flying around, because some of our bats do call around the 17 to 18, maybe 20 kilohertz range, and we're able to hear those clicks as they're flying by. It's pretty fascinating. So we know that if we're out there and we hear these bats, that's probably a big brown bat or a hoary bat, who are larger species of bats here in West Virginia, that we can actually hear with the human ear as they're flying around and calling. But a great way to navigate around and see in the black of night and find these insects that are out there and avoid objects that are out there flying. Also, our bats are, they're nocturnal, but they kind of have this biphasic activity period. So right at dusk, so as the sun is setting, they'll come out and start feeding for maybe a couple of hours. And they're very much like me. So at the middle of the night, maybe I need to take a siesta. I need to take a break. I've eaten too many insects. And so they'll be active for a couple of hours and then go find a roost to kind of hang out and rest. And in the middle of the night, Then right before sun up, they'll get up and feed again, and then go find their roost for the day. So we had this biphasic or two phases of activity, early in the evening and then early in the morning. A little siesta or rest time there in the middle. But they're always out at night. We may see some, during the daylight hours, right at dusk, or even in the morning time. But most commonly, they're out at night and hidden under cover of darkness. They breed in the fall of the year, so our bats breed. In most cases, our bats are separated. Males and females are feeding and foraging and roosting and staying in different locations. But in the fall of the year, they'll meet, they'll breed, and it has delayed implementation. And so they don't start gestation, or actually the young developing, until the spring of the year. So they'll breed in the fall, and then the young will start developing in the spring when they emerge from hibernation. So you have this kind of short window when there are insects out there on the landscape, and so you don't want to waste time finding a mate and trying to breed when you need to be out there feeding on insects. And so they'll breed in the fall, development gestation begins in the spring. Most cases, our bats will have just one pup, so one pup per year. Have a couple of species that can have two, and some can actually have four. Those are our larger species, but in general, they only have one pup per year. So a very low reproductive rate, but they are a long-lived species, recordings of 15 to 18 years. So one pup per year, and then a 15-year lifespan. So it's an interesting reproductive strategy as we go forward. The pup also weighs about 40% of their body weight. So the female will give birth to a pup, which is about 40% of her body weight. So that's a significant size and significant energetic cost in having young. So I would think if my mom, if our babies, human babies, were 40% of the mom's baby weight, I probably wouldn't have a little sister. That's a significant cost in that, and that was a significant birth in giving young to a young that is 40% of their body weight. So some of our bats actually hibernate during the winter, and so they are our true hibernators. And so they go into a thermally stable or an environment that has a pretty constant or consistent temperature. They go into these thermally stable areas such as caves, old mine shafts. Some will hibernate in houses or barns or domestic structures, but they go in, they reduce their metabolic rate, their body temperature, their heart rate, and they live off fat they've stored up, during the summer months. Now they don't go in and just hang out and they're asleep for the entire winter. There are times of mobility. They'll move around and stretch around. Some of them are singular, like this eastern pippestrel here. Some have kind of colony roosters, and so there'll be a large group of bats that are on the ceiling of this cave. I want to be during the winter months, I want to be the one in the middle, staying warm. I've got all my friends and family around me, keeping me warm in the middle. I don't want to be the one out here on the outside or hibernating singularly like this one, because you can see, the moisture, the frost that's on the fur. These are in high humid areas, and so you'll see this transition of frost and moisture that occur on the fur and on the wings. But they're going into hibernate around September, coming out in April and May, depending on the species. Now, we often consider, our bears. When we talk about hibernation, we talk about our bears, but they are not considered our true hibernators, because they go into a time of rest. They have a reduced metabolic rate, reduced respiratory rate. But it's not as significant as our true hibernators, or not as significant as our bats. Their body temperature is just a few degrees above freezing. Some of our bears, they'll drop their temperature, their body temperature, maybe 5 to 10 degrees, but that's still well above freezing, where our bats drop their temperature so low, it's just a few degrees above actual freezing point. So our true hibernators, about eight of our 14 species that occur here in West Virginia are true hibernators. But we do have those that migrate. And migration is just that, two-way movement following resources. So they may be spending their summers here in West Virginia, but as temperatures start to drop and the number of insects start to decline, they'll fly to warmer conditions, or they'll fly south to kind of find some better conditions to spend the winter. And then they'll fly back during the summer months. And some of these are of local migrators. Some of our bats will migrate short distances, maybe a county-wide or a few hundred miles to get to a place to hibernate or spend the winter. But some are significant distance migrators, and they're going to migrate. A picture here on the right is kind of a sketch of our eastern red bat, and they'll migrate all the way here from this northeastern United States. They'll fly down to the southeastern United States to spend their winter. Or on the left is an example of our hoary bat, our largest bat species here in West Virginia, where if you look at kind of break the United States in half, so here on the West Coast, this is where most of our males spend the summer. And on the East Coast, this is where our females spend the summer. And they'll migrate down to the Southwest or central southern United States to migrate and spend their winters down there. So this is kind of a significant migratory pathway. Now, it's not like our neotropical migrant birds that fly all the way down to Central and South America, but still a long way to fly for a bat during the summer months. So they kind of take this separation of the genders, boys and girls on opposite sides of the United States to the extreme, right? Because they're on opposite sides of the coast of the continental U.S. But very interesting behavior there. Some of our bats can carry diseases. The most common one we kind of hear about is rabies, which is fatal to humans. It's fatal to bats as well. And so as soon as they get it, they can be acting erratically. In most cases, when our bats contract rabies, it changes their behavior, so they may be flopping around on the ground, and they're sick, and they're kind of out of their mind, if you will. It's called dumb rabies. They're not acting normally. And so a pet, maybe our cat or dog, will try to pick up that bat or play with it, and then they're bitten. And if they're not vaccinated against rabies, they can get it and potentially give it to us. So if you ever see a bat that's sick or acting abnormally, flopping around on the ground, make sure you have some type of barrier between you and it. So if you have to pick it up, maybe use a shovel or something to pick it up and move it, or have gloves on so it can't bite you. Rabies is transmitted through saliva. And so when they bite you, that saliva gets into an open cut or that wound that is caused by that. And it is 99% fatal in humans. So you do not want to get rabies. So you'll always see us wearing gloves to protect us from being bitten. We've also taken rabies vaccines. And so in case I'm exposed, hopefully my immune system can fight that off and I don't contract full-blown rabies and die, because I'm a big fan of living right now. So we always take those precautions. And there are other diseases they can carry and can be associated with it. Coronavirus is one of those. It's probably on the top of everyone's mind now. The coronavirus has now jumped in the human population. It's genetically similar to one that's been found in bats. And so it's been hypothesized that this virus actually originated in our bat species and it jumped into the human population. And so be careful, with any wildlife species or any domestic animal. We want to make sure that we're taking the proper precautions to protect ourselves and those animals as well. There are many predators around, the United States and the world that feed on bats. This is a bat falcon that feeds on bats. There's some snakes that will hang out on the roof of caves. They will pick off bats as they're flying by. Some spiders will actually catch bats, or large enough to catch bats in their webs. I don't want to walk into that spider web right there. Luckily, these don't occur here in West Virginia, so we don't have this issue. Our hawks and our owls, sometimes raccoons, will feed on bats when they're in the roost or in the cavity, or even flying out of their cavity. Here's an interesting picture of a cane toad. Now, this toad is about 10 inches long from the nose to the tail. Most of our frogs will eat whatever they can get in their mouth. And this toad actually captured a bat. So you can see the tail of the bat and the wings sticking out of its mouth. Just another predator to worry about out there on the landscape. Not a common feeding diet strategy for our cane toads, but very interesting nonetheless. When we capture bats, we're trying to capture them in mist nets, which is this real fine, think about a food worker's hairnet or hairnet, very fine. It's kind of, we string up over ponds and streams and over corridors. And as bats are flying through, we hope, most of the cases, they see these nets and can avoid them. We kind of catch the dumb ones, those that aren't paying attention, and they actually fly into the net. Or we have what is called a harp net. And it's kind of, if you can picture a harp, these vertical strings, set two harps side by side and kind of offset one. So they are quick and maneuverable enough to fly through the first set of strings, but they can't navigate and change flight quick enough to get through the second. And so they'll kind of get tangled in these strings and fall down into the bag, and we can capture them that way. Also, we will go into caves and count bats and kind of estimate populations or try to capture bats that way, especially during the daytime when they're roosting and sleeping. We have these sort of non-passive ways. You heard me talk about their echolocation calls. Here's an anabat, and there are some ecometers that are out there that we can record their calls and help identify those bat species by their calls. And we can put radio transmitters on them, attach radio transmitters that send out a signal, and we can track these bats across the landscape to find out where they're feeding, where they're roosting, what they're doing across the landscape. There are a lot of threats out there for our bats, changing habitat, disturbance of their hibernacular, disturbance in these caves, pesticides, wind turbines, and the alternative energies processes that we're using now are causing some issues with our bat populations and bird populations, and disease. One in particular is the white nose syndrome, which you may have heard about, which is this fungal disease that was introduced into the United States and is found in our caves where these bats are trying to hibernate, and it's causing significant mortality. You can see some of the lesions here on the bat wings. We have 3 species where it's caused over 90% mortality, and so 90 out of 100 bats have died because of this fungus. It was introduced in New York, and now it's spread into about 30 different states, 5 Canadian provinces. So a significant mortality event causing a big decline in our bat populations. So we've had a lot of bats lost, a lot of mortality. So the question is, how do our bats respond to that? How do bat populations respond? And what's that going to do to the insect population? Because these are all bats that feed on insects. So we have this surge in insects that are out there. So a lot of questions right now about our bat mortality due to white nose syndrome. We do have 3 federally listed species here in West Virginia. The northern long-eared bat is our most recent, and it is listed as a threatened species, whereas our Indiana myotis and Virginia big-eared bat are federally endangered species. So they're endangered of becoming extinct, whereas the northern long-eared bat is threatened of becoming endangered. So it's kind of one step back. But something to keep an eye on as we're watching these populations of bats. So let me introduce you to 12 of our 14 species we found here in West Virginia. This is our largest bat species, the hoary bat. It's about a 16-inch wingspan. If you measure it from the top of its nose to its tail there, so here's the eye, here's the nose, here's the wing. It's just kind of roosting here on the side of this tree. Interesting coloration, kind of a frosty color. This is one of our migratory bat species. So this is the one, the females are found on the eastern U.S., the males are on the west. And it's the largest bat species. This is a kind of a foliage rooster. So it's not using a cavity or anything. It's just kind of hanging out in a clump of leaves out on the end of a limb. Our second largest, I guess, is the eastern red bat. Nice red coloration. You can kind of look at this membrane between the legs. These laserine species, the hoary bat and the eastern red bat, is fully furred. And so it's kind of like a little sleeping bag. So that if they're out there exposed to the elements, they can wrap up and stay warm and handle a little bit more extreme conditions than our other bat species. So eastern red bats. We also have the silver-haired bat. If my camera were working today, you can see a little silver in my hair as well. My girls like to refer to this bat as me because I'm getting a little gray in my hair. But a silver-haired bat. We also have the big brown bat and the little brown bat. We work hard at naming these things, right? Now, if you have a bat in your house or your barn, it's probably one of these 2 species. These are very common in domestic structures. So the big brown bat or the little brown bat are very commonly found in houses or barns in those domestic structures. Now, some of these look very similar. So if you look at the little brown bat, which is a myotis species or mouse-eared species, compare that to the northern myotis and also the Indiana bat, which are all myotis species, look very similar in coloration. We have to look at the presence or absence of toe hairs. So you have to have this bat in hand to see that it has or it does not have toe hairs, or some different characteristics of tragus, which is a little fleshy protuberance in the ear, color characteristics, facial characteristics. But we can tell them apart by their echolocation calls as well. Small-footed myotis, kind of the masked bandit of the bat world. Smallest bat here in West Virginia. You're over in Seneca Rocks area. They love to roost out there in those rocks and those rock faces at Seneca Rocks. The tricolored bat, or what I learned is the eastern pipistral. Tricolored, and it's kind of reddish brown coloration. These pink forearms and dark brown wings. Our evening bat, common bat, around the state of West Virginia. We just pulled one out of a house here a couple of weeks ago. It had been roosting in someone's house. And our 2 big-eared bats look very different because these ears are about 2 to 3 inches. So it's about the same length as their body. These are called the whispering bats. And so their echolocation call, if you could hear their echolocation calls, it's about 80 to 90 decibels. So it's extremely loud and it could potentially deafen you if you could hear it. However, these bats call at a much lower decibel, so it's a lot softer. So those echoes that are coming back are a lot softer than the normal ones. So they need these large radar dishes, so these large ears, to hear that echolocation call coming back. So we have the Virginia big-eared bat and the Rafinesque big-eared bat here in West Virginia. Our 2 big-eared bats spend most of their time in caves. So now what do we do? If you want to get out there and learn more about bats, that's the best way. Get to know all you can about the bats of West Virginia and beyond. You've got a lot of homework there. We've got 14 that have been recorded here in West Virginia, but if you really want to test yourselves, get to know the 1,400 bat species around the world, what they look like, their habitat requirements, some of the interesting facts about them. But as we're working, trying to manage and protect habitat for these bat species, we're protecting and even creating roost trees out there for them. West Virginia is 79% forested, so they have a lot of options that are out there across the landscape. We're protecting that hibernacula, those caves that are found across the state, making sure that we don't disturb the bats during the winter months and wake them up. We're also not moving this white-nosed fungus in between bats, making sure they're safe and healthy. And we're also enhancing summer and fall habitat, right? We want to have a lot of vegetation out there that's producing these insects for our bats to feed on. And so we're promoting that type of habitat to promote our bat species across West Virginia. But get to know your bats, talk to your friends and neighbors about how cool bats are and the great ecological services that they provide in insect control and suppression. But it's a nice, fascinating group of animals that are out there across the landscape. Can be found pretty much anywhere in West Virginia and around the world. So with that, I think we hit about the 30-minute mark there, Kevin. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of information about our bats. There's a lot more to learn, so I encourage you to get out there and learn more about bats. Do we have opportunity for questions there, Kevin? Or is everyone finished their school day and ready to get home and start?
Oh, I have a few questions, Sheldon, that I had talked to a few teachers this week, and they sent me some questions ahead of time. But I'm going to start with my question, if you don't mind. Are the hibernaculum, those roosting congregations, do any of the bats hibernate together in groups together?
Yeah, so if you look at our northern long-eared bats, they'll be hibernating in groups. And so if you walk into a cave and see those bats hibernating, it looks like the whole ceiling of the cave is actually covered with bats. Now compare that to the eastern pipistrelle, which was that picture. If you ever Google search hibernating bats, that's probably what you're going to see. The eastern pipistrelle with the frost on its fur, because they like to roost close to the mouth of the cave. You have these temperature differences and moisture differences. So we have some that are singular, but some that hibernate in those groups, especially the northern long-eared bats. And even the smaller little brown myotis or little brown bats as well.
Wow, thanks. I got a question from a teacher, which was about if bats have the bone in the ear that all mammals have. I hope I'm asking that right.
So mammals have the 3 inner ear bones. That's a good question. The hammer, anvil, and stirrup, right? So Inca, Malleus, and Stapes. Yes, maybe I passed. If there's a biology teacher out there, don't judge me. That was that's a long time trying to remember that. But they do have the 3 inner ear bones. They do have some other modifications. I've mentioned how loud that echolocation call is. Those sound waves they're sending out. So they have some modifications, and there's a tympanum within the ear that actually reduces the sound. And so when we hear our recording of ourselves, we always say, that doesn't sound like us, right? Because our ear kind of modulates and reduces those sound waves. They have a very specialized membrane there in the ear that will further reduce the sound of that outgoing echolocation call. But just like our other mammals, they do have the 3 ear bones.
That's fascinating. So here's a question. I hope I'm asking it right.
Any other teacher questions out there?
Yeah. Oh, can you hear me, Sheldon?
Oh, Kevin, you may have frozen up.
Oh no. Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. Maybe this could be our last question. It's about light and sound pollution. So, how are bats affected by light pollution and sound pollution at night?
That's a good question about sound pollution. I'm sure that, it does disturb them, but, we'll commonly see bats foraging over parking lots. As those lights are attracting insects, they're coming in and feeding on those insects. And so if you're thinking about maybe some heavy construction, this is creating sounds, that may deter a lot of species. But if there's really no negative stimulus, or if there are lights there that are attracting insects, then they're probably going to come in there and feed. That's just kind of like a buffet there of insects for them to feed on. So they can maneuver and move around those things. It's not something that's going to blind them or cause issues. It may, if it's really loud, may interfere with their echolocation, and they may just avoid that area. But you'll commonly see them in cities and in parking lots feeding above crowded streets. They had a project many years ago where we worked down in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we were following bat species that were going into Chattanooga to feed, and gray bat species that were going in to feed. So I'm sure there are some impacts, but overall, if those lights are attracting insects, if insects are there and really no other negative stimulus, those bats are still going to use those areas.
Great, thank you for answering that. And I'm going to tempt fate with one last question, which is a very practical one, hopefully, for us. I know I've had a personal experience with this, but if a bat gets in your house, how should you help it to get out?
You can open up the windows and kind of cut the lights off inside, and maybe cut the lights on outside. Help them find those windows. Again, they're easy to remove. You can either use a dip net. Some people use kind of a tennis racket. You can kind of steer them out to the window. I've captured them a lot of times in pillowcases or sheets and just kind of release them outdoors. You just want to make sure that you're not exposed. They can't get to you and actually bite you. Less than 1% of our bat population actually carry bats. They've estimated it's less than 0.5%. So it's highly unlikely, but there's still that risk, and we want you to be as safe as possible. So always have some type of barrier between you and it. So if you have some heavy gloves and can grab the bat or capture the bat and just release it outdoors, that's one way to do it. A dip net to get it outdoors, or a pillowcase to capture it in. Just make sure you're staying safe. But opening up all those windows and giving it the outside access that it needs. The issue will be is in most of these cases, the bat is roosting in the attic or roosting on the eaves of the house. And so, that bat's going to get back into your house some way to roost, and it may get back into the living area at some point down the road as well. So you need to, if you're having issues with bats in your house, make sure those bats have maybe left for the year, or you don't have any inside, and try to seal up all of those cracks and crevices which they may use to get into your house. But again, the take-home message is make sure you have some kind of barrier between you and it as you were trying to usher this bat out a window or out the door safely.
Well, thank you, Sheldon. That's all the questions I have. And I know folks have got other things to get to, but I really have enjoyed this, and I'm sure everybody else has too. I just wanted to give you an opportunity if there's anything else you wanted to mention coming up or say in conclusion.
I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk to you, because I love talking about bats. They're a fascinating group. But we've got a lot of programs. I know Kevin with Appalachian Headwaters, there's a lot of programs on pollinators, pollinator habitat development that's going on now. That's going to benefit our bats. The more insects we have out there on the landscape, the more food we're providing for them. So, just keep your eyes open for any opportunity where you can get out into your backyard or on your property and plant something, plant a tree or a flowering plant that's going to benefit our wildlife. Do what you can to help conserve our wildlife species across West Virginia. Not only bats, but we've got a lot of other cool species out there. So get out and learn about what you can do or how you can help improve habitat for our wildlife species.
Well, thank you so much again, Sheldon, and thank you all for joining us today. Like I said before, we'll be sending out the recording before Monday, and I hope you all have a wonderful Friday and weekend.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and enjoy, everyone.
See y'all.